Alex Williams is Director of City Planning at TfL. His role will be key as we emerge from the pandemic and as we reshape the city to reflect the changing patterns of growth, sustainability, and well-being. Now, Alex, you've been looking at 5 possible scenarios of what the city could be like in the future. Can you tell me what those different scenarios are, and do you have any thoughts on which are the most likely or the most preferable?
Yeah, very, very happy to. It's worth giving a bit of context to this, really. Is clearly the pandemic has had a profound effect on how this city functions, and in particular on the transport network. And it's unlike any previous change in terms of the duration of it. So I think it was right that we look at the longer term impacts about what London could be like over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. So we've developed these kind of 5 scenarios, and we've also now developed a single kind of hybrid scenario, which is where we think we're going, really. So if I just summarize the 5, the first one is the kind of quick bounce back, the bounce back to normality, which after, say, 7/7 and 9/11, there was a quick bounce back, and within months we were back to normality. And that is clearly an option or a scenario that could happen. And then we look at other scenarios that we also need to be mindful of. One is we call London fends for itself, which is a scenario where London doesn't get the support it needs to get it through this crisis, and investment is just not available or allocated to other parts of the country. And London starts to decline in terms of population, a bit like we were in London in the 70s, I think it was 70s and 80s, when the population was falling. And that's a kind of scenario that we need to be mindful of. Then there's 2 others that are similar in some ways. One is what we call low carbon localism, where and it does feel as though that's happening to a degree, really, which is this thing about people living and working more locally. If you think about central London, it's certainly during the week it's very, very quiet, but at the outer London high streets or inner London high streets have never been busier, and I think that's partly a consequence of a largely white collar population working from home and living and shopping locally and socialising more locally. So that could be a scenario that we have to look at. Remote revolution, we call, is a 4th scenario, which is this scenario where potentially people move away from the kind of high density living in London to a kind of low density, much bigger commuter belt. So it kind of pushes that population and that growth beyond the M25 to the wider southeast, or maybe even beyond the southeast. I remember Boris used to talk about the London Borough of Birmingham for HS2. So you could see a much bigger commuter belt as people travel in less, but on the basis of travelling in less, they're prepared to travel further. And the 5th scenario we've got is a kind of counter to the other ones, really, about saying, well, maybe this will lead to an acceleration of London. So we call it agglomeration plus, where we look at higher rates of growth in the London plan and actually a greater consolidation in the capital than the way that we've looked at it before, really. So there's quite a broad spectrum of bounce back to normality, London in decline, 2 different ways of seeing London operating, so as a low carbon or remote revolution, or London just goes on a kind of super boom, as it were. So that's the range, and we've done a lot of analysis on what it means for each transport mode, what it means in terms of population and employment, and also carbon. And we're developing a kind of hybrid scenario of where we think London is going at the moment. And one of the key things, I think, really, is that we need to keep it up to date. So we've got a hybrid scenario as it is now, but the situation is so fluid, so volatile, so subject to change that we will keep this up to date every quarter, because I think no one knows what's going on. We don't know whether we're going to go into the the next tier next week, or even a tier higher soon afterwards. So it's really important that we do keep it under review. But the hybrid scenario we think is most likely to happen is one is the impact of this is going to be felt for a long time. You think about 2008, the financial crash. That was felt for probably 10 years, maybe even longer actually. We're probably still feeling the effects of that. And it feels as though this pandemic, whilst there might be a return to normality post-vaccine relatively quickly, and we'll all think, oh God, I'm glad that's over and we're back to normal. I think the effects of it are so profound that we will probably see an effect on this for the next 10, 15 years, really. So one, I think the key thing about a hybrid scenario is it's not going to be a quick bounce back. It's going to be a long time to get to full recovery to where we were pre-pandemic. But we do see a combination of the two scenarios I talked about low carbon localism and remote revolution being the ones that seem to be the most apparent, really, in terms of a kind of a blue collar workforce that is using the tube regularly and public transport regularly, which is why our ridership hasn't changed really in the last month, despite the government messages changing. But a white collar workforce that is either working from home more locally or looking at moving out to further afield so that they've got more amenity space, which is more important if you are working from home, really. So that's the scenario we think is that kind of combination of that hybrid of the low carbon localism and remote revolution is what's happening. But I do think, as I said earlier, I do think we need to keep it all under review because it's just so fluid at the moment, and it is going to take quite a long time to settle down.
You talk about the low carbon solution, and the green recovery has been a part of your plans for some time as well. I mean, how do you extend that to the whole system, as it were?
We need to shape the recovery in a way that is good for our planet and good for our economy as well. And I think, and there's a whole range of initiatives that we can look at in relation to the Green New Deal. And I think we also need to be mindful that it may be harder. We're going to go into a recession, stroke depression as a result of this. And often money for green initiatives gets squeezed out in that scenario as a kind of nice to have rather than essential. And I think that's one of the key things, to make sure that it is part and parcel of our offer. And we do make decisions on the recovery and in light of the broader challenge we need to do on carbon and decarbonisation. But I think if you go back to the trends on carbon, we've seen decreasing carbon emissions in London, and on the transport sector, that's mainly because as London has grown, the transport offer has been supported by a transport offer where more people are using sustainable modes, more people are using public transport, more people are walking and cycling. And what we need to do is to do more of that as we go forward, really. So on public transport, we've got around a third of normal patronage levels on the tube and around 60% normal patronage levels on the bus network. But what's quite interesting is that we've done some surveys, and I think it's around 2/3 of our normal passengers have used the network in the last month. And I think that what they are seeing is a clean network. They're seeing lots of face coverings. It does feel safe and well managed, and they're seeing a very punctual network in terms of the same frequencies on the Victoria Line, a train every 100 seconds, and that kind of level of frequency is there. So our line in terms of public transport is to decarbonise the transport sector. We need more people back on public transport, absolutely. But we need to do that, we have to make people feel safe and comfortable using it. So it's not feeling really nervous to it. You feel as though you're going into a controlled and safe environment. And that's really important to avoid what we call a car-led recovery, because what we're seeing is very kind of high levels of car, particularly in outer London, because people aren't using public transport there. And we need to get people back onto that. The other thing we're doing in terms of carbon is a big investment in active travel. So you will see what we call the London Street Space Programme going in around the capital. And we're just finishing that programme, 6 months of work, delivering kind of over 800 schemes. Some of them very contentious, although traffic neighbourhoods are contentious. A lot of them aren't, and a lot of them, the contentious people want to go further. The one interesting thing I think there is that prior to the pandemic, we had 150 kilometres of segregated cycle lane in the capital. In the last 6 months, we've added over 80 kilometres of segregated cycle lane to the capital. So we provided that infrastructure that is fundamentally important to getting more people cycling. They want a safe cycle network to do that, really. So I think investing in public transport, investing and getting the messaging right to make sure people feel safe and comfortable on it, but also investing in active travel through better walking environments and better cycling environments, I think they are fundamental to decarbonisation of our transport sector and that kind of green recovery. Our challenge is we want to work with the government to make sure that we get the appropriate funding deal to carry on with all of that work going forward. But it's absolutely front and centre of it. It's kind of going back to the Mayor's transport strategy about getting more people using public transport, walking, cycling. That is what decarbonisation is all about.
Well, that investment, of course, is really important. And Claire Moriarty, who's the government representative, as it were, on the TfL board, said at the last board meeting, not everything that is sensible from a business case is going to be able to proceed. And I guess that's probably looking at some of the bigger schemes. So can you give me an update on key new bits of infrastructure like Crossrail 2, Bakerloo Line extension and West London Orbital? Where are they now?
Well, I'm very happy to do that. Going back to Claire's comment, which I think was absolutely spot on, is the other thing that we need to do is we do need to review our business cases in light of the scenario planning we've been doing, really, because so many of those investment decisions or big infrastructure projects, rather, the case for them was predicated on how you provided extra capacity in the morning peak, that really intense period in the AM peak. And that's gone at the moment. It hasn't happened since mid-March. And it will return, but will it return in the same level of intensity that it was before, really? It's very difficult to imagine 5 or 6 people per square metre as it was pre-pandemic. Maybe that will come back, but at the moment, we don't know. And I think that for those projects that you've just listed there, we need to revisit and reassess the business cases and reassess them in light of this changing scenario about how London might grow and function with, maybe the 5-day-a-week commute into the office feels like it's dead at the moment. Maybe it will come back, I don't know. But in terms of those other projects, Crossrail 2 and Bakerloo Line are in a very similar position, really, in terms of the reality is we do not have the money to deliver them at the moment. There won't be any surprises there. They are very expensive schemes, very important schemes for the city, but the reality is we just do not have the money to deliver them now. If there was a big kind of fiscal stimulus post-pandemic, that we'll be fighting the case for those schemes to be part of that as any investment in London. But at the moment, the focus for both of those schemes is on safeguarding. So it's not abandoning them and saying we haven't got any money, we'll just forget about them. It's making sure that they are kept up to date and are protected from any future investment decisions that we have to make in a few years' time. So on Bakerloo Line, that isn't safeguarded at the moment, and the focus is very much on how do we safeguard it to the core route from Elephant Castle down to Lewisham. And on Crossrail 2, the safeguarding is several years old now, and there was a consultation. It needs to be updated and refreshed to make sure that we're protecting the most appropriate scheme. West London Orbital is slightly different, really, in the sense of that scheme. It connects a lot of growth areas, Old Upcombe on Brent Cross and down in Golden Mile and Hounslow, and it's a great scheme. But one of the ways we're pitching this scheme is that if you look at it, it's about reconnecting historical railway assets to provide a new service on a growth corridor. and we're positioning this as a beaching reversal scheme. So we put money into government for that, and we are, we're hopeful that we will get something on it. Whether we do in the context of, levelling up and money going elsewhere in the country, I don't know. But certainly that's where we're looking at the moment, is to bid for funding to support that new initiative, because it's a really good scheme in terms of it's a kind of outer London orbital scheme, and we always know that investment in orbital public transport is something that's always raised in our strategy discussions that people want to see happening, but it's often very difficult to get those schemes over the line. But we are still committed to Crossrail 2, Bakerloo and West London Orbital, and also the DLR to Thamesmead as well, really. So we carry on with them, but we just need to be realistic that the money isn't there at the moment.
Even in the future, if we don't have the peaks that maybe we had before, it's really important, particularly for the central area, the central activity zone, to convince people to get back onto public transport. So how are you going to do that?
Well, I completely agree with you and I think what's quite interesting about CAS is that we do need to have and the GLA are commissioning a study on CAS and trying to get a better understanding about where it is now, what are the challenges it needs to look at, what is the long-term future of the CAS. And I think one of the interesting things there for me is it's probably got the best public transport system in the world. Getting to it, it's hyper connected, and I think one of our challenges is what's best use of the space in London in the context of that hyper connectivity. So I do think that's something that we do need to think about it, and how do we protect the uses that are really important? Protect the office space for the financial centre, protect the biosciences, land uses, those kind of things really that are really important kind of parts of central London, and they keep that kind of London as it is, as a great city centre that it is really. How we get people back on public transport, I think the first point we look at is safety. People will not go on a system if they feel it's unsafe. And I think that it's quite interesting, the journey we've been on really, is that after March the 23rd, we were told to avoid public transport, and our patronage levels on the tube went down from 4 million a day down to 200,000 a day, so 5% of normal levels. And we kind of saturated the network with posters saying, don't use our network, only if you're an essential worker, things like that, really. And it was a time when there was a lot of fear, and we somehow kind of created a kind of fearful environment on the network as well, really. And I think what's happened over the last few months is that as we've got more lockdown releases, the messaging has changed to say, actually, you can use public transport, and we've kind of dialed down the fear levels so that what we're saying now is wear a face mask, and use the hand sanitizer we've got at stations. But by and large, it's safe to travel if you do that. And if you look at our network, I know there's a lot of attention to the people who don't wear a face mask, but certainly my experience of using the network is I'm really pleased that so many people do. It's one of those things where it's a rare sight to see anyone certainly on the tubes and trains that I go on where they don't have a face covering. So in terms of getting people back on the network, I think we have to address that issue head on about safety. So we are cleaning it at a much higher level. Not everyone, but the vast majority of people are wearing face coverings. If you go on a public transport system, it's not crowded. You will get a seat in the morning peak. That's the reality of what's happening now. And we're running high frequency trains really. So we're running those kind of high frequency trains. So that's why I think what's quite good is the surveys we're looking at saying it's around 2/3 of our normal passengers have used the network in the last month or so, and they do feel safe using it. The issue is, I think, that we're not going to go back to the pre-pandemic kind of peak crowding levels, until post-vaccine, to be honest, really. But what I find interesting is, since the schools went back in September, early September, our tube levels were around 34% of normal on the tube, and on the buses it was around 58% of normal. I looked at today's figures, exactly the same. So we've got this kind of plateauing of people using it and feeling comfortable using it. And I think in many ways they are people who don't have that option of working from home, and they have to work and go to work by public transport. The other interesting thing that's happening is tube usage and bus usage is higher at the weekend. So at the weekend, it's around 40% of normal. And my example is I was in Covent Garden at the weekend, and it was as busy as it was pre-pandemic. I was really shocked at it. Usually if you go into central London during the weekday, it feels really, really unpleasantly quiet. Whereas at the weekend, I was really struck. It's really busy, really vibrant. The only difference was people wearing face coverings, and there weren't the international tourists there, but it was busy, and I think people are hungry to get back to a bit of normality in some ways, really. So, and I'm one of them to confess. Really, I'd love to get back to normality, really. But I think in terms of getting people back on our network, the fundamental thing is making sure people feel safe.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, for sharing your thoughts. Yes, I've used the tube a few times in the last couple of weeks, and actually everyone I saw was actually wearing a mask. So the messaging there has worked, and very reassuring to the survey that was done. The number of contaminated surfaces was virtually zero. So that was quite reassuring too. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Cheers, and good luck, Peter. Thank you.